On the night meant to mark her rise as queen, she was found hanging from silk, her death sealing a mystery that would haunt the kingdom. The palace awoke to screams. In the grey light of dawn, servants rushed through marble corridors, their cries echoing off vaulted ceilings. Guards pushed open the doors to the royal chamber, and what they found would stain the kingdom's history forever. The bride, radiant only hours before, crowned in roses and jewels, now hung lifeless from the canopy of her bed. A length of silk cord, once meant to bind curtains in elegance, was looped cruelly around her neck. Her body swayed gently in the still air, her bare feet just brushing the polished floor. The wedding gown, torn and wrinkled, trailed like a ghost's shroud. Gasps filled the chamber. Some servants fell to their knees, crossing themselves, convinced they had stumbled upon a vision of hell. Guards averted their eyes, ashamed to witness such desecration in the royal household. Nobles soon gathered at the threshold, whispering behind trembling hands. One fainted outright. Another muttered that this was no accident. It was an omen. The groom stood frozen, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Hours earlier he had paraded his new bride before the kingdom as a symbol of alliance, wealth and power. Now his honour lay shattered, swinging in silence from a rope of silk. Word spread through the palace like wildfire. By mid-morning every courtier knew the bride had been found hanging. Rumours multiplied faster than truth. She had taken her own life out of despair. Jealous rivals had murdered her. She had been silenced because she knew something forbidden. Some whispered darker tales, that she had been cursed, claimed by spirits who resented the marriage. The king's rage shook the halls. He demanded answers, yet none came. The chamber doors had been locked from within, guards had stood watch all night, and yet by dawn the princess was dead. No intruder, no witness, no sound of struggle, only silence and the swaying body of a bride who should have been beginning her life as queen. The silk cord creaked as her body shifted. The image seared itself into the minds of all who saw it. The pale face framed by dishevelled hair, the vacant eyes staring into eternity, the necklace she had worn at the ceremony still glittering faintly against her throat. This was no ordinary tragedy. This was a spectacle of horror, a riddle carved into the very heart of the dynasty. And in the days that followed, her death would not only unravel the fragile peace her marriage had promised, but also give birth to a legend that haunted the kingdom for centuries. This is the story of the bride who was found hanging in the royal chamber, her wedding night ending not with love but with silence, silk and death. Long before the silk cord tightened around her neck, the bride's life had already been claimed by forces far greater than herself. She was born not for her own destiny, but for the throne. From her earliest years she was a pawn dressed as a princess, her every gesture measured against the future role she would be forced to play. Her lineage was impeccable. She belonged to a house of ancient nobility, a family whose bloodline traced back to saints and conquerors. Her father was a minor lord, proud but powerless. Her mother, a woman of delicate beauty and frail health, often compared her daughter's face to a candle flame, bright, fragile, and easily extinguished. In a kingdom built on dynasties, this fragile beauty was both a blessing and a curse. From childhood, she was raised in the shadow of duty. Tutors drilled her in languages, scripture, music, and etiquette. She was taught how to move with grace, how to bow without lowering her dignity, how to smile without revealing sorrow. Servants whispered that her laughter was rare, as though joy had been rationed to her in small measures. Even as a child, her eyes held something solemn, an understanding that her life was never her own. By adolescence, her beauty became a currency. Nobles who visited her family's estate remarked on her pale complexion, her golden hair, and her quiet poise. Word spread to the royal court that this girl might be worthy of a match far above her station. And when the king's advisors sought a bride for the heir apparent, her name rose to the top of their lists. She was not chosen for her character, nor her heart, but for her lineage and her face, the two things she had no control over. The negotiations were swift, brutal, and entirely beyond her. The dowry promised by her father nearly bankrupted his estate. In return, he secured prestige, his daughter's name tied forever to the royal line. The girl herself was not asked if she wished for this fate. Her consent was assumed, as if a princess could ever truly choose. When the betrothal was announced, the kingdom erupted in celebration. Priests declared it a blessing, poets composed verses of future glory, peasants toasted with whatever scraps of wine they could afford. Yet within the palace walls, not all celebrated. Some whispered that the match was cursed, that the bride looked too solemn, too pale, too unwilling. One courtier noted bitterly in his diary, "She does not walk toward marriage, she walks toward execution." To her, the months leading to the wedding were a slow suffocation. Seamstresses measured her for gowns, jewelers draped her in borrowed diamonds, and priests prepared her with rituals of purity. Yet behind each veil and crown was the unspoken truth. She was being dressed not as a woman, but as a symbol. The bride who would carry alliances on her shoulders, who would serve as proof that dynasties could bend fate itself. On the night before her wedding, she reportedly confessed to her chambermaid, "I feel I am being buried alive." The maid never repeated those words until many years later, when the bride's fate had already become legend. The royal court saw her only as triumph, as beauty, as promise. But those closest to her recognized something else entirely, a quiet despair that deepened with each passing day. She was a bride for the crown, not for herself, and that crown, glittering with jewels, was heavier than any rope. Even before the wedding day dawned, whispers of ill fortune clung to the bride like a shadow. The kingdom wanted spectacle, a union to dazzle nobles and silence enemies, but what it received instead were a series of signs that unsettled even the most pious priests. The first omen came during the formal betrothal mass. As the bishop lifted the great candle meant to symbolize divine blessing on the union, the flame sputtered and died. Priests rushed to relight it, but the wick crumbled into ash. To most, it was nothing more than bad wax. To others, it was a warning. An extinguished flame at the altar meant the extinguishing of life. Weeks later, as seamstresses prepared the bride's gown, another omen appeared. A mirror in her chamber, an heirloom framed in gilded angels, suddenly cracked from corner to corner without being touched. The servants gasped, crossing themselves. Mirrors were believed to hold fragments of the soul, and to see one split was to see a life broken. The bride herself stared at the jagged line with wide, unblinking eyes. "Perhaps it shows me," she murmured, her voice so soft that her attendants later argued whether she had spoken at all. There were other incidents, smaller but no less disturbing. On one morning ride, her horse reared without cause, nearly throwing her into the river. On another evening, as she knelt at prayer, the reliquary on the altar toppled to the floor, its glass shattering. A servant who gathered the pieces whispered that he saw blood in the shards. Whether it was true or not, the story spread through the palace within hours. The bride herself seemed to bear these omens in silence. Her face grew paler each day, her smile thinner, her voice softer. Some said she had accepted her doom. Others believed she was haunted by visions no one else could see. Her maids claimed that on several nights they found her standing at the window, staring into the darkness as if listening to a voice only she could hear. Among the peasants, rumours blossomed into legend. Old women muttered that the princess was cursed at birth, doomed to die before she ever bore a child. Others claimed her family had angered the saints, and she would pay the price. Market gossip turned darker still. Some said the marriage itself was an abomination, and that God would not allow it to stand. Even the royal astrologers failed to calm the dread. When asked to chart the stars on the eve of the wedding, they hesitated. One finally muttered that Mars and Saturn stood in malignant opposition. The king dismissed him with a wave, but the whisper spread. The heavens themselves foretold violence, and yet no omen could stop the machinery of politics. The wedding preparations pressed forward with relentless speed. The palace was draped in silks, the cathedral polished to a gleaming, and the feast prepared in obscene abundance. The king dismissed every dark sign as superstition. The groom laughed at the talk of curses. Priests assured the court that God would sanctify the marriage. But behind the gilded optimism, unease festered. Servants worked in silence, avoiding the bride's eyes. Courtiers whispered behind their hands. Even the queen, her mother, is said to have grown pale and restless, insisting her daughter carry a small relic sewn into her gown for protection. The omens had spoken, but no one dared listen. And so the kingdom marched toward a wedding day draped in gold and shadow alike. A day that would end not in union but in a silk cord swaying in silence. The wedding dawned with grandeur so overwhelming it seemed designed to erase every shadow of dread that had preceded it. Bells rang from every cathedral tower, their iron voices thundering over the city. Streets were draped in garlands, fountains dyed with wine, and peasants pressed shoulder to shoulder just for a glimpse of the procession. The princess sat veiled in a carriage of gold leaf, her pale face glimpsed only in flashes between silken curtains. To the crowds, she was the very image of majesty. To those who knew her, she looked like a candle guttering in a draught. The ceremony itself unfolded with the precision of a play performed 1,000 times before. Priests in jewelled robes raised their hands, the choir sang hymns until the air itself trembled, and the groom stood like a statue of bronze, his expression stern but satisfied. When the vows were spoken, her voice was steady enough to echo across the nave, though some swore it sounded more like resignation than joy. The rings were exchanged, the marriage sealed. A kingdom exhaled in relief. Then came the feast. It was a spectacle of gluttony and pride, the likes of which peasants would sing of for generations. Whole boars roasted with apples in their mouths, towers of sugared fruits gleaming like jewels, rivers of wine flowing into golden cups. Musicians played until their fingers bled, dancers spun until their feet struck sparks against the stone floor. Nobles boasted, laughed, and gossiped as if the kingdom had no troubles, as if omens had never darkened its doors. But amid the revelry, some saw what others missed. The bride sat at the head of the table, draped in silks and crowned with roses, yet her eyes were distant. She smiled when courtiers toasted her name, but each smile was brief, brittle, gone as quickly as it appeared. When servants refilled her goblet, her hand trembled so slightly that only her maids noticed. More than once she pressed her fingers to her temple, as if fighting a pain no one else could feel. The groom, flushed with wine, seemed oblivious. He paraded her like a prize, drawing attention to her jewels, her gown, her beauty. He raised her hand for all to see, his grip so tight it left faint red marks on her skin. Courtiers exchanged uneasy glances. Some whispered that the bride looked afraid of him. Others muttered that her spirit was already broken. As the night deepened, the mood grew heavier. The candles smoked, the music faltered, and the air inside the hall seemed thick with something unspoken. A priest later wrote that he felt the presence of death itself moving through the crowd. Whether it was imagination or prophecy, no one could say. At last, the time came for tradition. The bride was escorted from the hall by her ladies-in-waiting, the groom to follow after the last toasts. Guests roared with drunken cheer, singing bawdy songs about love and fertility. But behind the laughter, an unease clung. Some swore that as the bride passed through the great doors, her veil fluttered, though no wind blew. Others claimed she looked back over her shoulder, her eyes filled not with joy but with a silent plea. The chamber awaited her, silks, incense, candlelight prepared for consummation. Yet what those walls would hold was not union, but horror. For while the court drained the last of its goblets, and the musicians played their final notes, the bride's fate was already sealing itself in silence, and by dawn, the feast that had promised to crown a queen would be remembered only as the night a bride was found hanging in the royal chamber. The royal chamber had been prepared like a shrine. Every detail was chosen not merely for comfort, but for symbolism. The great bed stood at the centre, draped in crimson silks embroidered with golden lions. Bowls of incense smouldered in bronze stands, their smoke rising in twisting veils that perfumed the air with a sweetness so heavy it seemed to suffocate. Candles burned in silver holders, their flames casting long shadows that danced across tapestries of saints and conquerors. Here, the marriage was meant to be sealed, not by the priest's blessing, but by a tradition older and more binding. Within these walls, alliances were consummated, dynasties secured, and kingdoms bound. But for the bride who entered that chamber, it was not a sanctuary. It was a cage. Her attendants led her in with ritual solemnity. They unpinned her veil, loosened the heavy crown of roses, and unfastened the silk gown that had weighed upon her all day. Each fold of fabric was carefully laid aside, and each jewel was returned to its casket. When they were done, they kissed her hands, whispered blessings, and withdrew, leaving her alone beneath the canopy. The heavy door closed with a final thud, and silence pressed in. What happened in those hours no living witness could later describe. Some believed she knelt in prayer, begging heaven for mercy. Others imagined her pacing the chamber, her bare feet silent on the carpets, her hands clutching at the silk cord that hung from the canopy, as if it whispered to her. A few claimed she wrote a note, though if such a note ever existed, it was destroyed. What is known is this. By dawn, the door remained locked from within, the window still barred. Guards reported no sound through the night, no cry for help, no sign of struggle, and yet, when they forced the door at sunrise, the chamber became a vision of horror. She was hanging from the bed canopy, the silk cord looped around her neck, her body suspended above the polished floor. Her hair tumbled loose, her wedding gown torn and wrinkled. Her hands hung limp, her face pale and still, her lips faintly blue. The necklace she had worn at the feast glittered faintly at her collarbone, a cruel echo of beauty now stilled. The chamber itself bore no mark of intrusion. The sheets were smooth, untouched. The incense bowls had burned down to ash. Only the rope told the story, and even that spoke in riddles. Did she place it herself, in despair too deep for words? Or did another hand tighten the knot while the court celebrated below? The discovery was met with screams so loud they carried through the corridors. Servants rushed to the threshold only to recoil in terror. Guards blanched and crossed themselves. A noble fainted outright. And when the groom arrived, he stood frozen, his face twisting from disbelief to fury. To have his bride taken from him on the very night of union was more than tragedy. It was humiliation. The king's reaction was more violent still. He roared that she must have been murdered, demanded to know who had dared to bring such shame into his palace. But the chamber mocked him with its silence. Locked from within, guarded from without, it revealed nothing but the image of a bride swaying in the still air. And thus began the storm of suspicion that would consume the palace. A wedding meant to secure power had instead birthed a riddle of silk and silence. The royal chamber, meant to host life, had become a tomb. The moment the body was cut down, chaos erupted. Servants wailed, guards shouted conflicting orders, and nobles scattered through the halls like startled birds. The silken rope lay coiled on the floor, glistening as though it were a serpent that had struck in the night. No one dared touch it again. The groom's voice rose above the din. Humiliation burned on his face, his pride shattered before the very court he had hoped to impress. He demanded to know who had entered the chamber, who had failed in their duty, who had dishonoured his marriage bed. When the guards swore the door had been locked all night, his fury only deepened. "Then you are liars," he spat. "Or worse, traitors." The king's rage was more terrible still. He stormed into the chamber with a retinue of priests and advisors, his eyes falling upon the lifeless bride with a mixture of horror and hatred. To him, her death was not only a tragedy but a stain upon the crown itself. "This is no accident," he thundered. "This is treachery." His words were a death sentence for anyone who might be accused. Accusations flew like arrows in the dark. The ladies in waiting were the first to be seized. Dragged into torchlight, they wept and swore that the princess had seemed pale but alive when they left her chamber. One maid whispered through her tears that the bride had begged not to be left alone. The king silenced her with a gesture, declaring her words slanderous. By nightfall, she and others were imprisoned in the dungeons. The guards were interrogated next. They insisted no sound had passed through the chamber doors, no movement in the corridors. One swore he had glimpsed a shadow at the window before dawn, though the shutters were locked. His statement was dismissed as cowardice. Another claimed he heard faint sobs, but when pressed under threat of torture, he faltered, unsure whether it had been a dream or reality. Suspicion soon spread beyond the walls. Some whispered of foreign envoys, rivals who had attended the wedding only to sabotage it. Their chambers were searched, their servants questioned, their belongings rifled through. One ambassador was accused of smuggling poison, another of sorcery. Both denied everything, yet the rumours spread like plague. Each denial became proof in the eyes of those desperate for answers. The priests offered their own judgment. Some declared the bride's death a suicide, punishment for secret sin. Others whispered of possession, that demons had taken her in the night. The more superstitious courtiers clung to these words, muttering prayers and clutching relics. A few insisted the omens before the wedding had foretold this very moment, and that the crown itself was cursed. As the frenzy grew, the queen, the bride's mother, collapsed in grief. She demanded her daughter's body be treated with dignity, her death mourned as a tragedy, not cloaked in accusations. The king silenced her with cold words, forbidding further lamentation. To him, mourning was weakness. Control of the narrative was power. By the second day, the palace had become a labyrinth of fear. No servant trusted another. Nobles whispered in corners, terrified that a careless word might see them accused. The silken rope was kept as evidence, paraded before interrogations like a relic of doom. Yet no confession came, no clear culprit was found. The truth remained locked in the chamber's silence. Was the bride's death her own choice, born of despair too heavy to bear? Or had unseen hands tightened the cord while the court feasted below? Each theory condemned someone, yet none could be proved. What began as a wedding had become an inquisition, and in that furnace of fear the bride's voice was lost entirely. She was no longer a woman, but a weapon. Her death wielded by those who sought to preserve power, silence scandal, and rewrite history itself. As days passed and no clear answers emerged, the palace shifted from chaos to calculation. What could not be solved would be concealed. The scandal of a bride found hanging in the royal chamber threatened not just the honour of the groom, but the legitimacy of the dynasty itself. And so, the crown turned its fury toward the one weapon it could still wield: silence. The first step was to control the story. Heralds were sent into the city to proclaim that the princess had died suddenly of an unforeseen illness. They spoke of a weak heart, of fainting spells brought on by stress, of God's will claiming her before her time. Nowhere in their proclamations was there mention of silk cords or chamber doors. The words were delivered with solemnity, and the crowd listened with bowed heads. But behind closed doors, merchants whispered, servants gossiped, and peasants laughed bitterly at the lie. Within the palace, the effort was even more ruthless. Servants who had seen the hanging were threatened into silence. Some vanished altogether. The ladies-in-waiting, broken by interrogation, were never seen in court again. Courtiers who dared whisper of suicide or murder were exiled under the guise of ill health. The chamber itself was sealed, its doors barred, its windows locked, its silken canopy stripped bare. It became a forbidden room, a place no one entered, and few dared even to pass. The body of the bride was handled with speed that shocked even her grieving mother. Within a single day she was dressed in funeral robes, her neck covered with layers of lace and jewels. Her coffin was nailed shut before most of the court could glimpse her face. At dawn she was carried to the royal crypt under heavy guard. The ceremony rushed and hushed. No public procession, no cathedral bells. Only silence, as if the kingdom itself were complicit in burying not just a body but the truth. Portraits of her, once displayed proudly in the great halls, were quietly removed. Chronicles being drafted by court historians were edited. Her name shifted into the margins. In official records she was described only as the bride who died before her time. Her wedding feast, once meant to be immortalized in song, was never spoken of again. It was as though she had been erased, a shadow brushed from the canvas of history. Yet erasure breeds suspicion. Among the nobles, whispers persisted. Some claimed the groom himself had staged her death to escape an unwanted union. Others accused jealous rivals of slipping into the chamber through hidden passages. A few swore that the king had ordered it himself, sacrificing his daughter for reasons of state. None of these whispers could be proved, but the very act of silencing them gave them weight. Beyond the palace, the people kept her memory alive in their own way. Minstrels sang songs of the hanging bride, ballads too dark for the court but beloved in taverns. Peasants passed down tales that her ghost still walked the corridors, her veil swaying as if caught by unseen hands. For every official decree, a dozen folk stories were undoing it. The crown might control parchment, but it could not control memory. The cover-up succeeded, at least on the surface. Foreign envoys accepted the tale of sudden illness, preferring to avoid scandal rather than ignite war. The dynasty endured, the throne remained secure, and the chamber doors stayed shut. But behind the polished facade, the truth festered like a wound. The silk cord was never destroyed, only hidden away in the royal treasury, a mute relic of shame. And so, the bride was buried twice, once beneath the stones of the crypt and once beneath the lies of her family. Official history forgot her. Legend remembered her. And in that silence between truth and fiction, the seeds of haunting began to grow. No amount of royal proclamations or sealed doors could erase what had been seen in the chamber. Though the crown tried to bury the truth beneath illness and ceremony, whispers seeped through cracks in the silence, and in time, those whispers became legend. The bride was gone, but she was not forgotten. She became something far more enduring, a haunting. It began with the servants. They swore the chamber was not empty. At night, when they passed by its barred doors, they heard faint creaking like rope swaying under strain. Others whispered of footsteps pacing inside, though no one had entered for months. A guard claimed he saw a pale figure at the window, her veil trailing as though caught by the wind, before vanishing into the shadows. None of them dared speak of it openly, but in corners of the palace kitchens they muttered the truth. The bride had not left her chamber at all. Soon, the courtiers too felt her presence. During feasts, a chill would sweep the hall, and goblets trembled in unsteady hands. Some swore they glimpsed her in mirrors, her face pale and bruised, her eyes wide with sorrow. Once, during a banquet, a noblewoman shrieked when her necklace snapped and fell to the floor, claiming she felt cold hands tugging at her throat. The king silenced the story with threats, but unease spread like smoke. Beyond the palace, the common people shaped her into myth. Ballads were sung of the hanging bride, verses describing her silk gowns swaying in the dark, her voice crying from locked doors. Children were warned that if they lied, the ghostly bride would appear in their chamber and tighten a cord around their necks. Lovers whispered that she appeared on stormy nights, veiled in white, wandering roads to warn young brides of sorrow to come. Priests tried to suppress the tales, but even they could not resist adding their own. Some preached she was condemned for sin, her soul doomed to wander until her innocence was proven. Others insisted she was a martyr, taken too soon, her restless spirit a rebuke to a court that had sacrificed her for power. Whatever the version, the message was the same. Her death had not ended with burial. It had only begun. Historians centuries later struggled to untangle fact from fear. Some argued she had truly taken her own life, her despair too heavy for her young heart. Others claimed it was murder, hidden under a cloak of lies. A few dared to suggest something darker, that the chamber itself was cursed, that no bride could survive within its walls. But no theory satisfied the silence, for the evidence had long since been destroyed, or hidden. And so, the bride's story slipped into the space between history and legend. Painters began to depict her as a pale ghost draped in silk, her head bowed, her feet never touching the ground. Poets wrote of her as the eternal bride, locked forever on her wedding night. Travellers claimed to hear her sobs when passing the palace at midnight, or to see her veil, fluttering across battlements where no figure stood. The crown could erase her name from its records, but it could not erase the image etched into memory. A young bride swaying in silence, her life cut short by a cord of silk. That image was stronger than any decree, more enduring than any cover-up. It became a warning carried across generations, that power devours the innocent, that truth cannot be silenced, and that even death cannot always free the forgotten. To this day, they say, the royal chamber remains cold even in summer, its walls heavy with shadows. Candles refuse to burn within it, mirrors crack without reason, and those who linger too long claim they feel a pressure at their throat, as if silk were tightening once again. The bride may have been buried, but her legend lives, not as queen, not as consort, but as ghost, forever haunting the chamber where her story ended and where her presence never truly left. Centuries have passed, yet the story of the bride who was found hanging in the royal chamber still lingers like a shadow that refuses to fade. Kings have come and gone, dynasties have risen and fallen, but her fate remains suspended in the silence of that locked room. What truly happened that night? Was it despair that drove her to loop the silken cord around her neck, surrendering her life before it had even begun? Was it murder, a crime committed in darkness by hands too powerful to be accused? Or was it something darker still, an omen fulfilled, a curse that claimed its bride at the very moment she was meant to ascend? No chronicler could answer, no priest could silence the question, and so it endures. But perhaps the truth matters less than the image she left behind. In history, she became more than a princess or a consort. She became a symbol of innocence devoured by politics, of women sacrificed for alliances, of silence that still cries out through the ages. Official decrees tried to bury her, but legend resurrected her, giving her a voice stronger in death than she ever possessed in life. Even now, travellers whisper of her shadow seen flitting across ruined corridors, of her veil trailing in moonlight, of faint sobs echoing where no living soul walks. To the people, she is not forgotten. She is the eternal bride, the young woman who entered her chamber as a queen-to-be and left it as a ghost. Her story is a reminder carved in silk and sorrow, that power can control chronicles but never memory, and as long as her tale is told, she has not truly vanished. She hangs still, not from a rope but from the minds of all who dare recall her name,